Are you ready, Marco? See, yeah, there we go. See, I also have control up here now. But that's good. You do that. I don't have to mess with it. I always have control. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. We are going to be in Luke chapter 16. I'm already on. What do you want to do? Here, just turn down the main one. How's that? Better? You like that better? Yeah, you like that? All right. No, you do it. You do it. Me, I gotta get onto the right one here. There we go. Luke 16. Very good. And we are going to look at the last part of that chapter of Luke 16. Very, very well known. This is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. So I've been asked how to pronounce the title of the lesson today. Does anybody for I have extra points to give out today. They're not they're not worth anything, right? But you can get them. These extra points, and they don't actually exist. I just tell you you have them. So for extra points, how do you pronounce the lesson? Marco. He's on light red. No, he don't know. Anybody? Ooh, close. Very, very close. Dives. Dives is how you pronounce the title if you saw it on Slack or Facebook. Dives. That comes, well, it's a Latin word that means rich, right? And if you look at the Latin Vulgate, and you don't even have to know Latin to be able to do this. You can just look at the Latin Vulgate. You can go to like BibleHub.com, has like hundreds of different Bible translations, including really old ones, and so they have the Clementine Vulgate there, and you can go there and see this and check this out for yourself. And you can just compare it to the English, and you'll see you can basically make out the words. It's not that hard because English has a lot of Latin base to it. And so, anyways, you'll see where rich would be, and it's Dives, dives. That's the Latin word for rich. Homium dives, and that's rich man. There was apparently, and this goes. So this is the name of this story going way back. Very old name. We now call it the rich man and Lazarus. It was called Dives and Lazarus. And because of that, and because of the unfamiliarity with Latin, it appears that people thought that that was his name. That his name, the rich man's name, was Dives. It seems that way. It's hard to know because this goes way, way back, and we have very little actual, in the time or in the moment documentation of it. But it seems that way. Anyways, that's this. So it's Luke 16, and we are in, starting in verse 19. Kelly's there, so she can, if you use the arrow keys, Kelly, it just jumps verse to verse to verse. All right, so we're going to read this portion, although most of you are probably familiar with it. What'd you do? Well, now you're not there anymore. 16, 19. You're in a different chapter now. You messed it up. It was all ready. There you go. All right. It says, there was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and in hell he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, Remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And beside all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come thence. Then he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldst send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Abraham said unto him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father, Abraham, but if one went unto them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. All right. Like I say, this is a very familiar passage. Give me 1 second here. This is a very familiar passage, and it deals with a topic that I think should frighten or be distasteful for all of us. I find it sad that oftentimes evangelical Christianity can speak so lightly, so flippantly of the topic of hell, almost as if they're happy, gleeful that some people or any people would go to such a place as hell. I'm going to move this microphone stand a little bit, right in the way where I can't see them very. I hate not being able to see people. All right. I didn't make fun of you. I agreed. So this is not a topic that we should talk about lightly or flippantly. It doesn't matter who it is that we are considering or thinking about. Even your worst enemy, even the most horrid human being who's ever lived. The idea of hell, as the Bible describes it, is not something we should wish on anybody ever. Jesus Christ suffered what he suffered to save people from this fate, even people who killed him. As the very people who nailed him to a cross, who betrayed him, he prayed for them in the hour of his agony, saying that, Father, forgive them. Paul says he would rather himself be accursed than for the Jews who were his enemies in the gospel, that they go to hell. So no Christian should think it good or fitting or happy that anybody would suffer in hell. It should be a topic that should concern us greatly. So over the next few weeks, I won't be here next week, but over the next few weeks that I'm going to speak, I want to talk about the issue raised in Luke 16, which is the issue of hell. We're going to look at it from several different perspectives. Today, I want us to talk about this passage in itself and how it is interpreted or seen by many people. There's a discussion amongst people who read the Bible over whether or not Luke 16 is a parable. So before we talk about hell much, I think we should talk about that, because this is a very important text when it comes to dealing with hell. It's very hard to discuss the topic of hell and not refer or not base it substantially on this text. Well, there are many people who believe that this is a parable. In fact, it's called the parable of Dives and Lazarus, or the rich man and Lazarus. And so we need to consider that before we talk about anything else. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. A lot of people have the wrong idea or a misconception as to what the parables are. And by the parables, I mean the parables of Jesus. So there are parables in the Bible, a lot of them. The Old Testament has a lot of parables. There, you can just do a concordance search parable. You'll find there's 10 or 12 places, something like that. In the Old Testament, where you have something called a parable, you actually have some of the parables spelled out or written out in the Old Testament. So this is an old rhetorical device. And that's what a parable is. A parable is kind of like a metaphor or an allegory or an analogy. It's not those things, but it's similar, and it's a rhetorical device. It is a tool that you use with your words, right? It's a word tool that you use to make something clear, or to make something memorable, or to make something insightful. Different ways you would use that, but it's this tool. And so a very common, or very familiar use of the parable in antiquity is Aesop's fables, right? I don't know if you, I don't know if they teach this anymore in school. They should, right? But if they don't, then you can get a copy. It's, you can get it online for free. It's an old collection of what we might call parables that teach moral lessons through what we would call object lessons, right? It teaches moral truths by the way of object lessons. One of my favorite ones, the one I live my life by, my life parable, my life fable, is the man who has the donkey and the son and the bale of hay, or the pile of sticks, or however the version you read is. And he has the sticks on the donkey, and he's walking, and the son is walking. You've heard this, right? And people see him, and they go, well, that's terrible. You should be riding, and the boy should be carrying the sticks. So he puts the sticks on the boy's back, and he gets on the donkey, and then other people see that, and they're offended. Well, that's horrible. Poor little boy carrying the sticks. You should carry the sticks, and he should be riding. So he carries the sticks and puts the little boy on the donkey. And then other people see that, and they go, that's just horrible, making that animal do that. You should carry the donkey, and the boy should carry the sticks. And so he puts the sticks on the boy, and then he puts the donkey on his back, and they go over a bridge. And, of course, all of this is too much, and they all fall in the water and die. And the lesson of the story is you cannot please everybody. So don't try. That's a fable. It's a parable. It's a form of a parable. So oftentimes when we talk about parables, we picture in our mind things like Aesop's fables. And we think Jesus told parables in order to make complicated truths easy to understand. And oftentimes we want to teach the parables to children because we think, well, these are just real simple stories that Jesus told to make things clear. Nothing could be further from the truth. That is a complete misconception, a total misunderstanding, absolute misunderstanding of the parables. In fact, if you're teaching them that way, you're probably teaching them wrong. If you think that the parables are something to be taught to children, like they're little kiddie stories that make hard things easy, you probably don't understand the parables you're even teaching, because they're not that way at all. Jesus took the genre of a parable and he made it into something very unique. He innovated on this genre. He used it in a very particular way, a very specific way. So we need to talk about that a little bit, because there's a serious problem when we point to Luke 16 and say that this is another one of the parables of Jesus. It isn't that it somehow gets rid of hell, because there's a lot more text in the scriptures dealing with hell than just Luke 16. You can make Luke 16 a parable, and that doesn't necessarily eradicate the idea of hell from the scriptures. But it does do serious damage to the parables themselves, and that is unconscionable. It's unconscionable for Christians to dilute the notion or the concept of the parables of Jesus. The parables of Jesus are extremely important teachings. Extremely. There are things that Jesus taught by way of parable that he taught no other way. We have no other record of many of the things that Jesus taught in the parables other than the parables. And so if we dilute what parables are in order to get rid of a passage that seems a little uncomfortable in its content, in its form, in its expressions, we're going to look at that later, but there's a lot of very uncomfortable things with Luke 16. And it seems that if we could just call it a parable, we could get rid of all that uncomfortableness. And I don't just mean the fact that there's a hell, that also, but there's a lot of things, and we'll look at them in Luke 16, that are very uncomfortable to deal with. No matter how much you believe the Bible, they're very uncomfortable and very difficult. Well, we could get rid of all that, we think, if we just label it, let's just smack parable label on it. We can make everything allegorical, everything metaphorical, and then we can just get rid of all the unpleasantness that we find in this passage. The problem is we dilute what the parables are. And that is very serious problem. Very serious problem. Most people don't think that. Most people do not consider the parables with any degree of depth or seriousness. And that's a huge mistake if you want to be a serious student of the Scriptures. If you want to study the teachings of Christ, you cannot dismiss the parables. Cannot. You have to take them very seriously, and you have to understand that they are a genre apart. It's true he used a pre-existing rhetorical device, a pre-existing form of speech, but he used it in ways in which no one that I have found has ever used them before. Very important that we understand that. So, what I do want to talk about, we will in a minute. We're not going to at this exact moment, but later in this class, whether today or another day, I do want to talk about whether or not this is a parable. We'll look at some of that. Or is this an historical account? Does Jesus actually look into the real, actual history of the world and pick out two real living beings who was named Dives? Well, that was in the name, but Dives and Lazarus, and actually tell us what really happened to those real people? Is that what this is? Or is this just a dramatized historical account, meaning this does happen, but these people are basically fictitious representations of real people? There's different ways of looking at this. We ought to look at all those. But first, let's just talk about parables, because I think that the number one problem that comes from misinterpreting this passage, in my opinion, the number one problem is dismissing or diluting the parables of Jesus Christ. So we're going to talk about parables a little bit today. All right. So if you open a dictionary and you look up the word parable, you're going to get a definition that probably fits most people's misconception, which is that parables are simple teachings illustrating deep truths. And that's basically the Bible, the dictionary definition of a parable in most dictionaries. And that's probably true when we're talking about things like Aesop's fables. But it isn't at all true when we're talking about the parables of Jesus. First, let me tell you that parables are not simple stories. They seem simple because they're short, they're concise, they use all physical, in fact, that's one of the very interesting things. They're all set in earthly settings, right? Nothing is heavenly. There's no deep doctrine on the surface of them. It's about farmers and animals and harvesting and planting and plants and seeds and things like that. And so he has all these little elements. You got trees and you got birds. And it's like, okay, these are all things that are very simple. Therefore, the story itself must be simple. No, that doesn't follow. It would seem like that. They're like, if I have a story and it's real short and it talks about birds and trees and plants and this, well, it must be a simple story. No, not at all. Not at all. They are not simple stories. So we're going to read in Matthew 13, verse 10. Let's see here. Not coming up for me. You got it, Kelly? Oh, there we go. Matthew 13, and we're going to read in verse 10. This is after one of the most famous and important parables. So this is probably the most, I would say, in my opinion, it is the most important parable that Jesus told. It's the parable of the sower. You probably all have heard it or are aware of it. The sower goes out to sow. He sows in all kinds of ground. Different grounds come up with different results. The good ground bears great results. That's the summary of the parable. You've heard it all, probably have all heard it. So he's already told this parable, right? And it apparently, this is his first parable he's told. I say apparently because the Gospels aren't necessarily written in chronological order, and so I can't ascertain, but it seems by the context of what's being said and how the apostles respond to this teaching that this is his first parable, and it fits how Matthew has ordered the book, right? So in the book of Matthew, Jesus, for the first 11 chapters, is teaching very plainly, and there are no parables in the first 11 chapters of Matthew. In chapters 11 and 12, the Jewish leaders reject Jesus Christ and say that the work he's doing, he does it by the power of Satan and not by the power of the Holy Spirit, right? And at the end of 12, Jesus metaphorically disowns the Jewish people. He says, "Who is my mother? Who is my father? Who are my brothers? Who are my sisters?" He says, "Those who believe are now my family members." It's basically what he says. And in chapter 13, he starts telling parables. And so in 13 of Matthew, the public ministry of Jesus Christ changed dramatically. And the apostles realize it. They recognize this dramatic shift in his approach. Before 13, he's just speaking plainly, telling people what's going to happen, how things are. And 13, all of a sudden, he's telling these stories. These weird stories about plants and ground and seeds and birds, and there's no mention of God, there's no mention of the Spirit, there's no mention of doctrine. It's just like all of a sudden he's turned into this, Benjamin Franklin, Poor Richard's Almanac person. This. Some of you may not know that, catch that reference. You can look that up. All right. And so the disciples in verse 10 come to him. And the disciples came and said unto him, "Why speakest thou unto them in parables?" They're not understanding. Why are you talking like this now? All of a sudden you're telling all these stories. Why are you doing this? He answered and said unto them, "Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given." So the common idea of parables is Jesus taught in parables to make hard things simple. That's not what Jesus said. That's not what he said. They asked him, "Why are you teaching in parables?" And he said, "So that they can't understand." Meaning, the parables are not to clarify the doctrine. The parables of Jesus, were designed to obfuscate it, to hide it, to encode it. Nowadays, that's how we would say it. Jesus encrypted the doctrine, right? He encoded it into these stories that had very specific interpretations. You had to have a key in order to know what he was talking about. What are the birds? What is the seed? Who's the sower? What does the sun stand for? What are the rocks? All of these elements in the parables of Jesus all have specific meanings, consistent meanings. The birds in this parable of the sower are the same thing as the birds in the other parables. He reuses these elements, but they are used consistently and precisely. And there are no extraneous elements. There are no elements in the parables that don't mean anything. Everything means something. What does it mean? Well, if you're thinking it must be easy, then you're thinking wrong. Because Jesus said, "I made this intentionally obscure. I made this intentionally difficult, yet impossible to understand." Look what he says. He says, unto them it is not given to understand, in verse 12. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. One of the hardest things that Jesus says. Jesus was not a softy. He was not a feel-good preacher. Now, if you read that phrase a couple times, you'll realize Jesus is harsh. He's very, very harsh. That's not a criticism, it's just an observation. He says, 13, therefore speak I to them in parables, because they seeing, see not, and hearing, they hear not, neither do they understand. In case you may not understand the Old English type phrasing of this, he says, I'm speaking to them in parables, so that even though they are looking at what I'm saying, they can't see it. So even if they hear what I say, they won't be able to understand it. I don't want them to understand. Now that probably doesn't fit a lot of people's vision of Christ. The all-inclusive, tolerant, non-judgmental, right? No. Jesus says they had their chance. Now remember why he's doing this. In chapter 11, they have said for the second time, he gave them a pass on the first one, but they have said for the second time that the work that Jesus did, he did it by the power of Satan. I want you to understand the significance of saying this. This is what Matthew calls the unpardonable sin. It is the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. When people often ask me, what is the unpardonable sin and can I commit it? This is the unpardonable sin, and no, you can't commit it. The unpardonable sin was that the Jewish leaders knew full well who Jesus was. By their own testimony, they knew. Remember John 3? Nicodemus comes to Jesus, and he tells Jesus, we, speaking in the plural of all the religious leaders, he says, we know that you're of God, because no man can do the works you do except God be with him. So they knew that the works that Jesus was doing were only possible through the power of the Holy Spirit. So why would they say publicly that he was doing it through the power of Satan? Were they confused? Were they mistaken? No. No. They were not confused and they were not mistaken. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that he did the power by the work of God. They knew he was the Son of God, but they were envious. And this is fully documented in the Gospels. The Gospels pull no punches on this. It's very clear in the Scriptures, in the Gospels, that these religious leaders, with the exception of a few, like Paul, were not ignorant of who Christ was. They just didn't want to relinquish their place. Jesus told a parable to that end. The parable of the vineyard. Right? He sends the owner of the vineyard wants to collect the rent. He sends out servants, go collect the rent. The people that are supposedly renting the vineyard don't want to turn over the vineyard, and so they keep beating up the servants. And finally, the owner of the vineyard says, I know, I'll send my son. They'll see it's my son, and they will, pay the rent. They'll turn over the vineyard. They'll do what they're supposed to do. And when they come, it says that the renters of the vineyard see and say, look, it's the son. Let's kill him, and the vineyard will be ours. That is Jesus explaining that they were not ignorant. So when these religious leaders who have been tasked by God to recognize and identify Messiah, when instead of doing that, they say that he's doing it by the work of Satan, and they blaspheme the Holy Ghost, Jesus says, you cannot be forgiven. You are no longer my family. Only those now who believe will be my family. There's no more physical connection between them. Marco, yes.
Was it just the ones that accused him or was it that whole generation of unbelieving Jews?
So Jesus disassociated himself from all physical relationship. And the relationship to Christ then became only a spiritual one. Anybody who believed became family of Christ, the family of God, which is what we find explained throughout the New Testament, right? That now, it's like Paul says, we're the circumcision, not of the flesh, but of the spirit that worship God in spirit and truth. We're that. This is now, it's no longer a physical connection. The Jews thought we're going to be related physically to the Messiah, and that's going to be, that's going to be our salvation, right? And Jesus says, well, now you've lost that. Now, anybody who believes is my mother, is my brother, is my sister. That's my family relationship now, is a spiritual one. It can be Jews, but it won't be because they're physically Jews. It'll be because they believe. And when the moment it became a matter of faith, it then became open to everybody. It no longer mattered where you were born or who you were born to. It only mattered whether you believed. That's what happens in Matthew. That's why Jesus starts telling parables. And that's why he says, I'm speaking in parables because I don't want them to understand. They can no longer have access to these doctrines. And there's a lot more that you can say. You can now take those. That's just like a little seed for your thought. You can take that and read through the Gospels, and it'll make so many things in the Gospels make sense. So many things will fall into place once you realize what's happening. And this goes back again to reiterate, goes back to reading these texts, right, in total context. Don't focus on one phrase or one sentence or one verse or one chapter. Try to read these books and think. Don't try to memorize verses. If you have a great memory and you're good at it, wonderful. But look, I don't. I have a horrible memory. I don't hardly remember a single thing I can say, but I can think, and so can you. And so try to look at them and read them and just think, what is it saying? What's the point of these things? So many things will make more sense to you if you do that, I think. It did for me. Anyway, so he says in verse 13, that's why I speak to them in parables so they won't understand. And then verse 14 says, and in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, by hearing ye shall hear. I lost my place. By hearing ye shall hear and shall not understand. And seeing ye shall see and shall not perceive. That was the prophecy. It was prophesied that this was going to happen. And Jesus says, and you know what the fulfillment of that prophecy is? That I'm speaking to them in parables. Jesus is reiterating so there can be no confusion. These parables are not simplistic stories. They are encryption. He says, for this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart and be converted. You understand what he's doing? He's saying, I'm speaking to them in parables so they cannot be converted. That's tough. That's tough. And I should heal them. But look what he says, but blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For verily I say unto you that many prophets and righteous men have desired to see those things which ye see, and have not seen them, and to hear those things which ye hear, and have not heard them. Now what is he saying? He's saying your eyes see, your ears hear, you understand. How? This is how. Look what he says in verse 18. Hear ye therefore the parable of the sower. Now he's in private, right? When he was in public, he told this parable of the sower. Seems like a very simple little story. And he goes, no, I told it that way because they're going to hear it, they won't understand it, and they won't be converted. But you're blessed. Those of you that believe, that have that faith relationship with me, you're blessed. And you're going to hear. And now he tells it again, but decodes it. And then if you read it, that is what follows this next paragraph is the unencryption, the decoding of that parable of the sower. where he explains who the sower is, what the sun is, what the seed is, what the rocks are. Every element, every single element of the parable is decrypted by Christ in private. Now, there is another passage that on this same one, or another recording of this, which is Mark chapter 4, verse 9. Let's take a look at that. Mark chapter 4 and verse 9. I'm not going to read the whole paragraph because it's basically, much of it is a repetition of Matthew, but there is a detail that Matthew omitted that Mark includes here in verse 9. We'll start looking at there. I think it's this. Let me see. Okay, verse 13. We'll skip to 13 for a matter of time. He says, the whole thing is all that we had talked about already. It's a repetition. But look at this statement he makes in verse 13. And he said unto them, know ye not this parable? And how will you then know all parables? That's what makes this the most important parable of all the parables. It's the key. According to Christ, the parable of the sower, it's the key. If you've done, I don't know how many of you have messed around any with decryption or encryption or encoding things. I was always fascinated with that. I make little codes and try to break codes that stores have on their UPC codes and break software codes and things like that. And I got pretty good at it. But the best thing is when you can find a key, right? If you can find something that gets you started, you find some key. Usually it's user error. You can find some user error that gets you a key into it, and you start breaking the code that they've set up. Well, Jesus gives us a code, or a key, to break the code of the parables. It's the parable of the sower. What that means is that all the parables are going to be consistent with this key. This is one of the problems you'll find a lot when if you start doing some research and start looking at the parables and start reading some commentary or listening to people talk about them, you'll realize they're not being consistent. The birds are one thing here and there's something else over here. That's a common error in the parables. The servants are one thing here, but somewhere else there's something else. And it just changes to fit the need, right, of the student, whatever they want it to be. This is one of the problems I have with typology. I'm not against it. I know I have some very good friends that really love to preach in types. My granddad, that's almost all he did was preach in types. And so I don't think it's wrong, but I have a real problem with it in that they can never give me a key. So Joseph is a type of so-and-so at one point and someone else later, and then he changes to something else. It's like, no, that's not anything that I need a methodology where I can say, this is what this is, and that'll be consistent. That's hard to do with typology. That's hard to do. You gotta be very careful. The parables, Jesus, he was consistent. So whatever an element means in one parable is what it means. And you can't change it because it doesn't seem to fit your doctrine, which is what people do to the parables. They often change what the elements are because it doesn't seem to fit their doctrine too well. Can't do that. Jesus was consistent. And that's what he's saying here in Mark chapter 9. That's what he's saying. He's saying if you can't understand, if you don't know what the parable of the sower means, then you're not going to understand any of the parables. It's the key to the parables. Now, that doesn't mean that every element in all the parables are represented in this one. Many of them are. This is one of the longest parables and contains almost the most elements of any parable. And so many of the elements that you'll find in all the parables are decoded by Christ in this parable. But not all of them. But it's enough for us to understand how he's operating. And we can then put the pieces together and figure out all the other ones. But it all starts with understanding the parable of the sower. which isn't hard once he tells you what it means. You see, people say, well, I read the parable of the sower, and then I read how Jesus explained it. That's a simple story. Well, now it's simple. Everything is simple once it's been explained. But when Jesus told it and hadn't explained it, nobody had a clue what he was talking about. Not a clue. And I can tell you right now, what's amazing is people who nowadays have the benefit of the explanation, many of them still don't have a clue. It's crazy. It's like it's all been decoded and they still are getting it wrong. You got something? Yellow. Now, is it on the bottom? We're not getting anything. There you go. Try that. No, you're not getting anything. Yeah, there you are. It's good. You're good.
For just a second to what Marcos was questioning was that so the unpardonable sin applied to the Pharisees, and I think he was wanting to know, and then I also like, is it Joseph of Arimathea who donated the tomb? Or is that right? And then Nicodemus, were they also guilty of the unpardonable sin?
No, because they didn't blaspheme, and neither did Paul.
Okay, because he was asking, did that who did that apply to? I think was.
Well, that applied to the religious leaders who individually knew that Jesus was Messiah and rejected him out of envy.
Right.
They blasphemed, meaning they knew that Jesus did the work by the Spirit, and yet said he didn't for personal gain. That's what they did.
Yeah, and then they blamed it on the his teachings on Satan.
Well, the teachings weren't the problem. The problem is saying that he did his works by the power of the devil.
Right.
He said, you can blaspheme against the Son, it'll be forgiven you. But if you blaspheme against the Spirit, it will not be forgiven.
All right. Thank you. That clears it up.
And if you look, it's very interesting. If you look at Paul's record of himself, he goes out of his way to be very clear that even though he was a Pharisee, he was ignorant of who Christ was. He says, I did it ignorantly in unbelief. And he says, and that's why I was forgiven. That's what he actually says. He says, I was forgiven because I did it ignorantly in unbelief. Yes. So this is not something that, it's like a post hoc interpretation. This is something that runs through the Gospels, and Paul himself, as a Pharisee, goes out of his way to say, I know that we've heard this, but I want you to understand that's not me. I was forgiven because I did it ignorantly in unbelief. So did it apply to all Pharisees even? Like you mentioned, there were ones who believed. There were some who were ignorant. And God made that judgment. Well, what Christ was saying is, and it was like if the shoe fits, right, was kind of a statement. If you're blaspheming, you know who I am, and you're saying something you know to be untrue for your own personal gain, there's no forgiveness for you. You're lost. And that's the unpardonable sin. All right? Okay. Anything else? Anybody? Yeah, yellow. I'll let you do it, Marco, because we're like fighting each other up here. I have the power. You have the power.
Is that good? Okay.
She's good.
Yeah. So just to kind of piggyback off that question, the Lord had said, he reiterated it, but he had said in the prophecy before, lest they hear, lest they see, and be converted. Is that in reference to that unpardonable sin? Like, is it unpardonable because it cannot be pardoned, or because the Lord says, I will not pardon this?
I think it's the latter.
Okay.
That he will not.
And is there any kind of key, if you will, for understanding that, or is that just something to ponder that he doesn't expressly elaborate on?
I don't know that there's a way like where it's spelled out that way, but to me, to say that God cannot forgive anything is then to say that there's an impossibility to him. This goes back to our discussion on is it that God cannot condemn me or he will not condemn me? To me, it's the same exact thing. God can do anything he absolutely wants. And so anything he says is impossible is merely because he says he won't do it, not because he actually has an impossibility towards it. Anyone else? Okay. So we saw that parables have specific and consistent interpretation, right? Specific and consistent interpretation. So if we're going to say something is a parable, we have to be able to take, for instance, the parable of the sower and say, okay, here are the elements of the parable. Here are the ones we have decoded by Christ. And there's a couple, it's not the only one. There's a couple of them he actually explained out. And we can take all those elements and then look at them and say, what is he trying to say here? Well, there's a real problem in Luke 16. None of the elements in Luke 16 are found in any parables at all. That's a very serious problem with calling this a parable. We'll get to that later. Moving on. Another thing you have to understand about parables. Parables are key to understanding the coming kingdom. This is what Christ decided to encrypt, the information about his kingdom. Sadly, evangelical Christianity, or perhaps all Christianity, I'm just familiar with evangelical, so I speak of that. It may be all forms of Christianity. But evangelical Christianity has largely overlooked the doctrine of the kingdom. All they want to talk about is heaven. And it's a serious oversight, terrible oversight. If what your dream is as a Christian is to go to heaven, you have not understood the gospel of Christ. I'm not telling you there's no heaven. That's not the point. What I'm telling you is that is such a small issue. I did this. See, I used to think the same way. Don't take this as being high and mighty or condescending or judgmental. I thought the same way. Talk the same way, preach the same way as I hear so many I'm talking about. So this is not judgmentalness. I'm trying to help you. I went through and read the New Testament for one purpose. Find all the places where it talks about going to heaven. You know how many there are? Very few. I'm not saying it doesn't say that. That's not my point. My point is that is not the message of the New Testament. That's not the point of the New Testament. The point of the New Testament is the kingdom. That's the point, which is so much broader, grander in scheme than heaven. Heaven is a place, if you will. The kingdom is something else. And this isn't a study of the kingdom, so we can't get into that. But you should study the kingdom. It is what you are called to. Right? God's a king, not a caretaker. You're a son of the king, not a child of heaven, or whatever you want to call it. So it's very important you understand the kingdom is the issue. And Christ came, and his central thesis of his teachings was his kingdom. And almost all of those teachings are encoded in parables. There's almost no teaching of the kingdom that is not in a parable. That's why they're so important. We don't have a record anywhere else, hardly. Very, very little, very sparse teaching on the kingdom that isn't in the parables. So you can't just dismiss them. We cannot afford to dilute them. It's what we have to understand what the kingdom will be like. And the moment you start understanding a little bit about the kingdom, you realize you really need to understand it because it's not what you think it's going to be. You are not going to intuitively figure it out. Because according to Christ's own teachings in parables, everything about the kingdom is not what you expect. The first will be last, the last will be first. We all like to quote that. You know what he's saying? You have no natural inclination to be able to understand what the kingdom is like. You're going to have to learn it. It's going to have to be told to you. That's what he says. It must be revealed to you. Meaning, you cannot intuitively deduce your way to it. It's not just that it's upside down. That's just a figure of speech. right? Because then we could just take everything and turn it upside down, and we'd have it. That's not what he means. What he means is it is nothing like what you'd expect. Anything that you can naturally deduce, you can naturally conclude, will be wrong. You're just going to have to learn it. I'm going to explain it to you, and you're going to have to accept it by faith. It's the only way you're going to understand the kingdom. And you need to understand the kingdom. You desperately need to understand it. And that's how he did it. So let's look at a couple texts real quick. Matthew 13:34. Look what he says here. He says, all these things spake Jesus unto the multitude in parables, and without a parable he spake not unto them. So this, even though we only have a sampling of the parables of Christ, what we're told by the gospel writers is that Christ did not talk in public from that point on without talking to them in parables, basically. Everything he told them from then on was parables. And then it says he would then in private explain them to the apostles. Why are the apostles so important? More important than the prophets. It's much more important that you read the New Testament than the Old. Much, much, much more important. Jesus explained it in Matthew 13. He says, the prophets desired to look into these things, and it was not given to them. The prophets have no clue about the kingdom. They only know that it's coming. But it says they examined, they asked diligently what manner of time it would, and the only answer they got was, it's not for you. He's talking about the kingdom. Yes. Who was the kingdom explained to? The apostles. That's why they matter.
Excuse me.
Oh.
Why say them at all? If it wasn't for them to know, and he was going to have to explain it to the apostles later, why even give a parable?
That's a good question. So the reason he tells it at all is we find it recorded in a number of passages, right, where he says they're without excuse because they did hear. Just because they didn't understand, that's not his problem. Again, this comes to the harshness of Christ. You're like, well, that doesn't seem right. You know, if you say it encoded, and then you say, well, it's my fault I don't understand, but it is their fault. Just like it was the fig tree's fault that it didn't have figs on it, even though it wasn't fig season. See, you desperately need to study the kingdom. In the kingdom, that makes sense. Now it doesn't. You're like, that's not fair. I see all the fairness flags going up around here, right? Like, that's not fair. Right. There's no fairness in the kingdom. You really need to understand the kingdom. In the kingdom, that makes perfect sense. It just does. It makes perfect sense in the kingdom. I'm not saying that because it's like natural to me. I'm just telling you. If you really take this seriously, read through the Gospels, especially, but read through the Gospels, read through the New Testament, start focusing on the kingdom and the kingdom terminologies, you realize that hardly ever talks about heaven, talks about the kingdom all the time, and what it says about the kingdom will blow your mind because it's nothing like what you think is right. But that's why. It's so they would be without excuse. So that hearing, they wouldn't hear, and seeing, they wouldn't see. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but that is the answer. Okay. So what does he say? He says he didn't speak to them for any way other than with parables. Says the same thing in Mark chapter 4. We won't look at it, but he says basically the same thing. He only would speak to them publicly in parables. That means that all this teaching that Christ did, profound teaching on what the kingdom is, how it's set up, what you're supposed to be doing to approach it. You know why I think Christians like the idea, I got to end here. You know why I think Christians like the idea of heaven? Because it is so non-responsibility. It's like you're being pulled by a tractor beam up into heaven, right? You don't even have to work. You just And you're just being pulled up like a sci-fi movie. As you slowly die, because you're dying every day, as you slowly die, you're just being hauled up into heaven. And it doesn't really matter what you do because you're going to heaven anyways. And that's true to a certain extent. I'm not saying that's not true. What I'm saying is, kingdom's not like that. You know where the kingdom is? It's in you. That's what Jesus said. The kingdom is in you. It's all around you. You're part of it. Right now, you're in the kingdom. You read the parables of the kingdom. There is no lack of responsibility there. It's all about responsibility. We got to end there. We will continue this in 2 weeks.